Thank you for the very powerful introduction there. I think that was a great, set the scene very nicely. My name is James Smallcombe, and I'm based at the Heat and Health Research Centre at the University of Sydney. And compared with the last session, we're going to change gears a little bit. We're going to go back to some more basic science. And this is actually going to be a hybrid session. I'm going to kick you off, and then my colleague Fahim is going to join on Zoom to wrap things up with a bit more policy consideration. I'm going to present a study today that was very generously funded by the Wellcome Trust, focused on the issue of extreme heat in the ready-made garment factory in Bangladesh. So this is just a screenshot of the title of the paper that is currently under review in Lancet Planetary Health. And I just wanted to highlight the collaborative nature of this project. We have researchers from the University of Sydney, based at the Heat and Health Research Centre. We have colleagues at Griffith University that have contributed to this study a great deal. And we also have a fantastic team of researchers based at the Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology. And I would just like to assure you that here, Munir, he's much friendlier than he might look in this picture. It's all I could pull from Google. And then finally, we have some friends of the program based in Colorado, and then also at Monash University down in Melbourne in Australia. Now, just a little bit of background. The ready-made garment industry is economically and socially vital to Bangladesh. It contributes approximately 15% of its GDP and up to 84% of its exports. And it employs approximately 4 million workers across 5,000 factories across the country. So it's hugely important economically. However, in some of the factories in Bangladesh, the work conditions are notoriously tough. Workers typically work very long hours, they're paid by piece, and they're often exposed to very extreme heat and humidity conditions. So there is an urgent need to identify sustainable solutions to protect these workers against these very hot and humid conditions that they encounter often on a daily basis. But importantly, we can't always fall back on air conditioning as being the solution. So in Bangladesh, for example, this is often unfeasible to install air conditioning across all of these factories, and it's also economically unviable. So we have to find low-cost, accessible alternatives to keep people comfortable and safe whilst at work in these factories. So where did this study begin? Well, in 2021, we actually partnered with a factory in Bangladesh in Dhaka, and this factory was conscious of the issue of heat and humidity in the factory and wanted to do something to help protect their workers. So what we did is we installed 33 temperature and humidity sensors across the factory, which was a three floor factory. And we continuously measured the temperature and humidity across an entire year. Now, what this enabled us to do was profile what the environmental conditions looked like in the factory over the course of the year. And you can see that this differed depending on the level of the factory. Of course, the top floor of the factory tended to be the hottest part of the factory. Now, this is in part because heat rises, but also a lot of the hot machinery, such as irons, were located on the top floor. Now, if we just zoom in a little bit closer to what happened to be the hottest month of the year, which happened to be May in 2021. Now, on the y-axis, we have temperature, and then along the x-axis, each peak is the peak temperature observed in the factory on any given day. Now, what becomes clear is that the peak temperature inside the factory regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. And this was often accompanied with very high humidity as well. So typically 38% relative humidity, which at 40 degrees Celsius is a lot of water vapor in the air. And not only did we survey the environmental conditions in the factory, we also surveyed and interviewed the workers. And one of the things that consistently emerged as one of the major challenges for these workers was the issue of extreme heat and humidity and the impact that had on their well-being and productivity whilst at work. So with this in mind, I'd just like to introduce what we call the problem to solution cycle. And this is something that we try to adopt in lots of our research at the Heat and Health Research Centre in Sydney. And based on the environmental data and the survey and interview data we collected from participants, we clearly identified that heat was a major health problem for these workers. But in order to design and implement effective solutions, we first need to understand some of the underlying mechanisms that are causing the issues. Now, these could be physiological, these could be social, these could be political, they could be a combination of all of these factors. Secondly, we need to identify potential solutions to the problem. And it's crucial that this is done through stakeholder engagement, through conversations with factory managers, workers, people that are making decisions in the industry, because there is no point in proposing solutions that will never be adopted in the context that we're trying to apply. Once we've identified candidate solutions, we then have to perform some type of proof of principle testing to figure out which ones work, which ones don't, which ones may be optimal. So what did we do? We performed 2 separate studies. Now, the first was a building simulation and modeling study, whereby using the data, the environmental data that we collected over the course of 2021, we were able to virtually reconstruct the factory using building design software. Now, that enabled us to model and characterize the thermal performance of the building. So for any given outside temperature, we could estimate what the indoor factory temperatures would be. And then using the same approach, we were able to virtually modify the factory through modifications such as rooftop modifications, such as the installation of extensive green roof consisting of vegetation or a white reflective roof. Now, what this modeling yielded was it showed us that this type of intervention could reduce the indoor factory temperatures by approximately 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, which is quite good for a building level modification. But this brings us on to the so what. We need to know whether these reductions are physiologically meaningful, if they're sufficient to improve worker well-being. So we aim to test the efficacy of these building level modifications, both in isolation, but also combined with very simple and accessible personal level cooling strategies. So what we did is we recreated the conditions that we observed in the Bangladeshi factory in our climate chamber in Sydney. Not only did we recreate the environmental conditions, we also recreated the clothing that the workers wore. We also simulated the tasks that they would typically perform at work. So the females sewed through this kind of simulation, and the males ironed. Now, participants all performed 6 separate 3-hour experimental trials, the first being a control trial, which resembled current day conditions in Bangladesh, so 40 degrees Celsius, 38% relative humidity. We then replicated this condition, but with the simple addition of an electric fan, which increased air movement in the factory. Thirdly, we coupled current day control conditions with an electric fan, but also allowed workers to drink freely. The fourth intervention is we simulated the reduction we would anticipate through a roof modification. So the temperature was dropped by 2.5 degrees Celsius. And then we coupled this with the addition of an electric fan. So we increased air movement to 1.5 meters per second. And then finally, the workers perform these occupational simulations in air-conditioned environments. Now, this served as a positive control to see how close, in terms of the benefits of aircon, we could get with these more sustainable interventions. I'll just quickly talk you through the protocol. So participants would attend the lab and they'd be instrumented. They would then perform 5 separate work bouts of 30 minutes in duration, and that's comprised of continuous sewing or ironing. We intersperse this by 2-minute intervals of light stepping, just to simulate movement around the factory floor. And during this process, at half-an-hour intervals, we asked participants to provide the ratings of their perceptions of the thermal environment, and we also continuously measured heart rate and core temperature. In total, we completed 40 complete data sets, 2 incomplete data sets, and this comprised of 22 males and a total of 247 3-hour trials. So it was a very large study. So what did we find? So we're going to start with the primary outcomes, and these are the physiological outcomes. Now, all of these figures are the data on the y-axis. They're expressed relative to the control trial. So the difference compared with current day control conditions. So in terms of core temperature on the x-axis, here we see that 4 of the 5 interventions lowered core temperature compared with current day conditions. The only one that didn't was the fan in isolation trial, but importantly, it didn't have a detrimental effect. If we move on to heart rate, all 5 of the interventions led to a significant reduction in heart rate, which is indicative of cardiovascular strain, which is an excellent outcome. And then finally, if we look at sweat loss fluid deficit, which gives us an indication of dehydration, we see that 3 of the interventions were effective. And unsurprisingly, the condition in which we allowed workers to drink freely lowered sweat loss deficit, as did the modification of the roof. And unsurprisingly, air conditioning did too. Just in terms of the secondary outcomes, and I'm running out of time, but an important outcome here for us was the difference that these interventions had on worker performance, their ability to perform work. Now, air conditioning was the only one that resulted in a significant difference, but importantly, none of the others resulted in any detrimental impact on work performance. And that's really important because managers are often concerned that allowing workers to freely drink or take extra breaks might be to the detriment of the work performance. All of the trials improved thermal comfort. All the workers felt more comfortable in all of the intervention trials, and they also felt cooler in all of them. So from a well-being perspective, this is really crucial. I'll skip the final one because I'm running out of time, and I'll just return to the problem to solution cycle. Now, what these data have generated is a proof of principle test of interventions that work. But of course, now the next steps are testing these interventions in the field and then hopefully resulting in changes in practice and policy. Now, this is where Fahim's going to jump in and wrap things up for us. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so my name is Fahim Tonmoy. I'm a director in Deloitte. I work in its climate change and sustainability team. So this project was conducted before I joined Deloitte. So whatever I present here today is none of them are actually Deloitte's view. So thanks, James, and good afternoon, everyone. It's actually good morning here in East Coast of Australia. James has already outlined that we have a compelling scientific evidence showing that how hot some of these factories can get, and we also have identified certain interventions that can reduce some of this physiological heat strain. In my talk, I'll try to talk a little bit, go a step further, try to explain that what this science means on ground for policy and action in Bangladesh. In terms of, let's just quickly zoom out a little bit. In Bangladesh, extreme heat is not just about being uncomfortable. It's already a productivity issue. A 2019 ILO study showed that the manufacturing sector loses about 2.5% of total working hours every year to heat stress, and by 2030, it's likely to get double. And because of climate change, we are seeing a sharp rise in the number of days each year where the heat index, which combines temperature and humidity, crosses 35 degrees Celsius, which is a threshold where work becomes physically challenging and potentially unsafe. And after mid-century, under a high emission scenario, almost 5 months of the year are likely to be such extreme condition in Bangladesh. So essentially, it's for policymakers in Bangladesh. It's not just it's not just a workplace issue. It's a question of economic resilience, women's health, and global competitiveness because RMG factor plays such a big role. Now, we now know that certain things actually can be done at a building scale, as James said, at an individual scale to help reduce some of these things. The question is, how can we make them happen on ground? So before we talk about implementing any of these solutions on ground, we need to understand the current reality inside these factories, right? So it's important to start by recognizing that there is a diversity of Bangladesh's RMG sector, right? There's a different types of factories. Yes, the country is a home to 9 of world's top 10 LED, LEED certified green garment factories, showing what's possible at the high end of the performance. But many other factories still operate with basic protections from heat, with poor ventilation, limited cooling, and no formal thermal comfort standards. So we wanted to understand what the workers actually feel inside the factory. We conducted a detailed field survey. James mentioned about that. We surveyed about 70 workers, and what we found through analyzing all those different thermal comfort votes is that the workers are tolerating heat that's about 5 to 6 degrees higher than what's global comfort standards like HT55, for example, define as acceptable. Also, they reported thermal neutrality, which is a temperature where they felt neither too hot nor too cold, was about 5.7 degrees above the predicted value by ASHTO models. Now, from an adaptive thermal comfort perspective, it's not surprising. Over time, workers get adapted, especially with chronic heat exposure, poor building design, and also the fact that cultural norms in Bangladesh discourage speaking up about discomfort. So the question is here, just because the workers say they're okay, does that mean they're safe? That's probably not the case because our data shows that a lot of the times temperature exceeds 40-degree temperature, which is physiologically it's very dangerous. So we wanted to take that to the policymakers, that all the scientific evidence that we created through this project with all the climate projection, thermal modeling, James's physiological testing, our field survey, and we conducted a national roundtable with government, industry, and factory representatives in Dhaka. It wasn't about just presenting the findings. It was to ask more about difficult questions, that what needs to change in policy and practice to keep workers safe in such conditions. There's a bit of broad, so the lot of key stakeholders participated there, including peak bodies such as BGMEA, PKMEA, who are the garment manufacturers, peak bodies, Ministry of Labor, trade unions, development partners, all participated there, and there was a broad recognition of the problem. But it actually identified some messy realities as well, that who's going to pay for all these things? Cost remains a major concern, especially among factory owners under pressure from buyers. Lack of technical guidance that leaves stakeholders unsure about how to act, even when they're willing to do something about it. There's no single agency currently has a clear mandate to lead on this issue. And without any regulatory incentives or buyer pressure, there's a risk that these findings just remain academic and never get implemented. So the round table, one clear thing came out of that we need to test this solution on ground to understand what's feasible and what's acceptable and what can actually work in practice. So we created another project to test some of the solutions, the low-cost solutions that James was talking about, like hydration, breathable clothing that can reduce heat strain, And the idea was can these work in real factories in a busy production environment? And that's where the behavior change comes in. So one of our PhD student, Farzana, led the pilot project with 2 garment factories in Dhaka, where the goal was to understand that if we provide training and raise awareness of these issues, can this change behavior of garments worker, and does it work? So the interventions themselves were very simple. We provided training on hydration, help workers recognizing the heat risk, signage and reminders about staying cool, drinking water, guidance on heat-aware clothing, and the basic warning system, usually daily heat bulletins and color-coded flags. So at the end we found that it actually change their behavior, and we conducted another stakeholder like a roundtable after that to discuss the findings. There was a clear sign of progress that workers were more aware, the supervisors were engaging, and hydration stations being used. So there's a good sign there. So now that's my last slide. So the question that where this leave us then? So over the past few years, we have created this body of evidence of work. We talked to the stakeholder policymakers. We tested some of those things in climate chamber as well as in factory. The message is clear that Bangladesh's factories are already facing rising heat stress, right? That's clear. And we also have some tested solution that can actually work. Now, the question is, how can we, how do we make it happen on ground, right? So there's no political Bangladesh-specific thermal comfort standard now, which needs to be developed. High risk isn't systematically factored into labor law audits and factory design, which needs to be happen. Factories often lack clear guidance, and few incentives exist from buyers and regulators to prioritize heat safety. And behavior change takes time. It is possible, but it takes time. It's support and reputation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.